A couple weeks ago, I shared what I know about witness statements, and one of the things I said is that if you can't get yours, don't stress. Just focus on documenting your case the best way you can. So today I want to talk about documentation. Here are some examples of the types of documentation that we can use. The ones that I used are highlighted in yellow, and as you can see, that's most of them. Copies of incriminating emails, text messages, voicemails, or recordings where they're allowed to help prove our allegations. Copies of messages between us and HR or us and other officials, just in case later on they want to claim they had no idea the discrimination was happening. Copies of any forms we submitted or received, along with any revisions to those forms, just in case something gets misplaced later. Copies of meeting logs can show that important meetings happen, even when they forget them. Work logs can show changes in our assignments. So like if they start giving us more demeaning work, or giving us more than our fair share of shared duties. I used copies of printer logs to prove that my boss had printed copies of my medical documentation, even though she claimed she had never received that documentation. Copies of your employer's written procedures and policies, just in case they decide to change them later. And in the description, I'll leave you guys some specific recommendations about policies you might want to look at. Copies of performance ratings or award nominations, in case your employer decides to accuse you of conduct or performance problems later on. We want everything time-stamped, and if it's not already, email is an easy way to do that. When I wanted to keep handwritten notes or meeting handouts, I took photographs of those things and emailed them to myself, so they'd be time-stamped. You're going to want to organize your documentation and keep it secure, and I have a couple of other videos about how I did those things that I'll link in the description. Now, I didn't know this when I was starting out, but EEOC cases are actually proven in phases. And what EEOC has to accomplish in each of those phases is laid out in Management Directive 110, MD 110. Now, each person we encounter at each step of the process is looking for specific information from us. Nobody in the process ever looked at all the documentation that I had. Not my counselor, not my investigator, not even my AJ. They all just looked at subsets of it, which at the time was incredibly frustrating because I felt like I had all this great documentation and nobody cared. So I want to give you guys a better idea of what to expect by sharing with you what EEOC expected from me at each step of the process. That's going to help you stay focused on what matters as you go through the process and avoid wasting time on things that EEOC isn't even going to look at. Let's start with the informal phase. NASA had an internal policy that laid out what the diversity manager was supposed to do in response to my complaint of discrimination. She was supposed to try to work out a resolution between my boss and me, and to do that, she had to verify what had actually happened. So I went into our first meeting planning to walk her through all the evidence that I had. But just a few minutes into it, I realized it was a waste of time because no amount of evidence was ever going to convince her to admit the discrimination had happened. So I gave her a few things, a couple of emails that showed I had requested reasonable accommodation and my boss refused to discuss it, the names of 2 witnesses who had seen what happened, and copies of my medical documentation that proved I had a covered disability. I put everything else in my hip pocket for later. Next was the counseling phase. My EEOC counselor was the first person who wasn't on the NASA payroll that I ever talked to about my claim. So again, I went into our meeting with all my documentation, expecting to walk her through it. And once again, she was not interested. She only seemed to want 2 things: the information she needed to draft legal claims for my allegations, and the information she needed to assess my prima facie case of discrimination. Now, the specific information you're going to need is going to depend on the basis of your claim. And I'm going to cover some of that in a future video. But essentially what I had to prove is that I was a member of a protected class, that I suffered an adverse employment action, and that others who were similarly situated but not members of my protected class were treated more favorably than I was. Those things are what MD 110 said my counselor had to do, and that's what she did. So even after my counseling phase was over, I still had a lot of documentation in my hip pocket. Next came my investigation. I gave my investigator everything I had that could back up my allegations. I left out the names of 2 witnesses that I didn't want to drag into it because it would have put their jobs at risk. I didn't give her copies of the policies and procedures that I had emailed myself because MD 110 said she should be getting those from NASA. And I kept my defensive documentation to myself. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Also during this phase, my investigator asked me for documentation that I didn't already have. For instance, my boss had told the investigator that she had the power to refuse to let me use my sick leave. I said she didn't have that power. So my investigator asked how I knew that she didn't have that power. I went off in search of that information and found it in our collective bargaining agreement, which we should probably add to the list. Now let's get back to defensive documentation for just a minute. In the time frame between filing my complaint and the start of my investigation, NASA had accused me of a lot of things, and I had gathered copies of emails, performance ratings, and award nominations to counter those accusations. But to my surprise, during my investigation, NASA didn't repeat any of their allegations to my investigator. They said I was a fine employee and they had reasonably accommodated me. Case closed. So I figured if NASA wasn't going to make the accusations, it's kind of pointless for me to defend myself against them. So I continued to keep that documentation in my hip pocket. Next was my hearing phase, and the first thing that hit me in this phase was NASA's motion for summary judgment. And that's when NASA's accusations came flying back. That gave me a chance to use that defensive documentation that I'd been hanging on to. So when NASA claimed that my boss had tried to discuss reasonable accommodation with me, but hadn't been able to because I was such a terrible communicator, I was able to pull out copies of the past 3 years of my performance ratings, where my boss had praised my great communication skills. That documentation put an end to that pretext and got me my hearing. However, my AJ still used NASA's motion for summary judgment and my response to it to de-scope my hearing. He limited the discussion to a few core issues that he wanted to consider and refused to hear anything else. So if you were to read my hearing transcript, which is a few hundred pages, you wouldn't see the 2,000 plus pages of documentation plus witness affidavits that were in my report of investigation. The final decision about my case was based on a fairly small subset of the documentation that I had. I made my peace with that. It's the process, and I did win. But I do think I should give fair warning to those of you who think having your day in court means that all your evidence is going to get considered, because that's not how the process works. The EEOC process is basically a culling process, and our cases get proven in phases. So that's how we have to release our documentation too, in phases. My rule of thumb was to keep every piece of documentation that I had to myself until I knew it mattered and was going to help me. I mean, sure, I could have given NASA's diversity manager everything I had on day one, whether or not she wanted to see it. And I'm sure there are people out there who think that's what I should have done. But if I had, even more witnesses would have gone quiet and even more documents would have disappeared, and I could have lost my case. So I'm glad that I decided to keep some of my cards in my hip pocket until I knew I could play them in a way that was going to work in my favor. And I encourage each of you to think about how you can do the same thing. I'll see you guys in the next one. Till then, take care and hang in.